role of city-to-city cooperation in contributing to realizing the democratic promise, or the promise for a democratic right to the city. So essentially my paper seeks to interrogate the potential of city-to-city cooperation to engender inclusive urban governance and development by critically analyzing cooperation partnerships between Brazilian and Mozambican cities, which are undertaken within the framework of Henri Lefebvre's idea of the right to the city. And the underlying premise of my paper is that by exposing local authorities and communities to useful experiences, best practices, and innovative ideas that have been tried and tested elsewhere, city-to-city cooperation can serve as a tool for making urban governance and development more inclusive. However, I argue throughout the paper that for city-to-city cooperation to serve as an effective mechanism that enhances urban democracy in a manner that gives expression to the right of the city idea, these exchanges must become more than just technocratic exercises, which are largely depoliticized and tend to overlook the unequal power relations in cities. So I want to start by briefly talking about Henri Lefebvre's idea of the right to the city. Lefebvre introduced the right to the city in the 1960s as a critique of modernist conceptions of the city as a technical object that must be planned and built by technocrats with objectivity and scientific accuracy. He argued that the right to the city, or the city, was not a backdrop but a space produced ideologically and politically, and a medium for strategies and struggles. In this regard, Lefebvre criticized the functionalist approach to urban planning, which, while pursuing the ideal of an orderly and efficient city, was accompanied by the eviction of the working classes from the inner city and the stifling of the autonomous social practices through which city dwellers took part in the production of urban spaces. The Lefebvrean idea of the right to the city is therefore a call for the radical transformation of the power relations that underlie the production of urban space, fundamentally shifting control away from capital and the state and toward urban inhabitants. It challenges exclusionary forms of urban development and land use, which are underpinned by a liberal legal and political tradition that prioritizes individual property rights over collective rights, and which constrains the state's interventionary capacity to promote a more inclusive urban society. Somewhat different from its original and radical conception, the right to the city is deployed today by social movements and even UN agencies, mainly as a progressive response to the urban manifestations of neoliberal capitalism. It advocates for enhanced urban democracy to redress traditional and elitist forms of urban planning and governance, which create cities that prioritize the interests of business and the wealthy class, while generating urban poverty, socio-spatial exclusion, gentrification, and environmental degradation, some of the things that we've talked about over the past days. I think I should also point out that there have been a number of critiques against the concept of the right to the city, and part of the argument that has been put forth by scholars such as Kafui Ato is that instituting the right to the city is bound to generate political conflict among urban groups that interpret rights differently. This means that the right to the city can only be claimed through processes of negotiations and trade-offs. Mark Purcell makes a similar argument to the effect that the right to the city should be seen as nothing more than a catalyst for an urban struggle, with the potential to either engender inclusiveness in the city or entrench new forms of political domination. I now want to proceed to briefly talk about the experience, Brazil's experience with the adoption and implementation of the right to the city principle. And I think the point is that because of time, I cannot go into the details of what was done in Brazil and some of the challenges that were encountered there. But the point I want to highlight is the fact that some of the critiques that have been made against the idea of the right to the city somehow bear true in the Brazilian experience, to the extent that if you look at how the right to the city idea was adopted in the form of the Statute of the City in 2001, and the struggles and the challenges that have accompanied the efforts to implement this legislation, you realize that the right of the city cannot be taken for granted. The fact that the idea has even been put into legislation is no guarantee that the outcome will be a progressive outcome, because there will always be other interests within the city that will challenge the progressive intent that underpinned the principle of the right to the city. In the case of Brazil, for example, you see that the efforts of left-wing political parties and social mobilization was very instrumental in ensuring that the principle of the right to the city was entrenched both in the Constitution and in the statute of the city legislation. But over the years, in terms of the implementation, even though there were some gains in some cities like Porto Alegre, over time in other cities like Sao Paulo, there was a significant backlash from conservative elements and property owners who sought to redress some of the gains that had been made to try to bring some form of inclusiveness in the city. And it is this same experience that Brazilian cities, with the support of their government, particularly during the presidency of Lula da Silva, and international organizations like the EU, the ILO, and city networks like the UCLG, that Brazilian cities sought to export their experience of implementing the right to the city to African cities, particularly in those Lusophone countries where they've got these historical ties. And Mozambique was one of the key examples where Brazilian cities tried to use their experience to promote urban reform in the context of Mozambican cities. However, I do argue that even though the right to the city, efforts to implement the right to the city in the Brazilian context was underpinned by a political struggle and social mobilization, when it came to the attempt to try to export this experience to Mozambique, this experience, the political struggle and the social mobilization element was actually left out of the cooperation initiatives between Brazilian cities and their Mozambican counterparts. And I therefore make the argument that, seen from that perspective, city-to-city cooperation has not really delivered in terms of the promise to democratize the city in the form of creating greater space for all the city dwellers to participate in the city life. So although couched in a discourse of promoting democratic and inclusive urban governance and development, the cooperation initiatives sponsored by institutional actors such as the World Bank, the ILO, UCLG, and even the Brazilian government have predominantly taken on a rather depoliticized and technocratic approach. They have tended to focus almost exclusively on knowledge exchange, study visits, and capacity building exercises involving mainly city technicians, administrators, and elected officials, which in my view are incapable of inducing the kind of democratic reform that the right to the city demands. As was the case in Brazil, this requires significant redistribution of power in the local political environment. Without aiming to transform urban power relations, city-to-city cooperation can at best improve the technical and administrative capacity of city government. At worst, it can serve to reinforce the disenfranchisement of marginalized urban communities. So in the paper, I illustrate this argument by drawing on 3 examples of cooperation between the city of Maputo and its Brazilian counterparts. The first example revolves around attempts to promote the inclusive use of inner city space. The second example looked at efforts to try to institute the practice of participatory budgeting in the city of Maputo based on the examples in Porto Alegre. And the final example that I discuss extensively in my paper looks at efforts to secure the livelihoods of waste pickers, or what are commonly referred to as the catadores, in an inclusive solid waste management system, again in the city of Maputo. And in all these three cases, what stands out is that the local elite were able to determine which ideas and best practices derived from city-to-city cooperation are localized and how this is actually carried out. And needless to say, that the ideas and practices that are perceived to threaten the power and the interests of the elite have been fiercely resisted. For example, in the case of attempt to actually make the use of the inner city space to be inclusive by allowing street vendors to also have a place within the city. The ideas and the advice that were derived from the city-to-city cooperation between Brazilian cities and their counterparts in Maputo, there was an attempt to try to institutionalize these ideas within the city of Maputo by developing a new city policy. But eventually, because the ideas that were adopted from these exchanges ran against the interests of the elite for an orderly city, this policy was not adopted by the City Council of Maputo. I would just want to, because of time, I just want to conclude by talking about how I believe that city-to-city cooperation can be made to be a significant catalyst for inclusive urban transformation. I agree with the paper that in order to make city-to-city cooperation as a tool that can contribute to democratizing the urban space, we need to bring back politics into these exchanges. This calls for a reconception of these partnerships not as a neutral technical exchange, but as inherently political tools with the capacity to distribute power among the different stakeholders in the city. And this means that the design and implementation of this partnership also has to be democratized to ensure that key social groups with a stake in particular urban issues are involved actively in the transnational linkages that shape the governance of these issues. Democratizing city-to-city cooperation this way has two benefits for the fight against inequality and exclusion in the city. The first is that by broadening the actors involved in city-to-city cooperation and embedding these exchanges in the social dynamics in cities, these exchanges are transformed into a site for renegotiating power relations in the city rather than reinforcing them. And secondly, an inclusive approach to city-to-city cooperation will afford marginalized groups the opportunity to network with and draw inspiration from their peers in other countries with the potential for effective social activism. I'll end here.
Thank you very much.